The rifle range smelled of wet grass, cordite, and American coffee. The air was crisp, the kind of clear autumn sharpness that made every sound distinct, the echo of gunfire rolling across low hills, the murmured conversation of Marines and hunters, and somewhere behind the firing line, the click of a camera shutter. Lieutenant Lyudmila Pavlichenko adjusted the unfamiliar rifle in her hands, its polished walnut stock still warm from the sun. The weapon was an American Monet Springfield, lighter than her own Mosin Nagant, yet balanced like a hunting piece. She had come a long way from Sevastopol's shattered bastions to this quiet field outside Washington, District of Columbia. The Soviet government had sent her across the Atlantic as both symbol and soldier, a living legend, the woman credited with more than 300 confirmed kills, the sniper the press called Lady Death. Her task was diplomatic, to plead for a second front, to remind Americans that while debated strategy, her comrades were dying on the Black Sea cliffs. But here, among these riflemen in flannel shirts and campaign hats, the war felt impossibly distant. "Ma'am," said a tall sergeant of Marines, his accent thick with Carolina drawl, "any time you're ready. Just breathe easy, let the deer come to you." She understood only fragments through her interpreter, but the rhythm of the sentence pleased her. Let the deer come to you. It sounded like something an old Cossack hunter might say on the steppe. She exhaled slowly, the front sight resting against the white steel target at 300 yards. The trigger broke clean. The plate rang once, sharp as a bell. A ripple of applause followed. American newspapers would print that photograph the next day, Pavlichenko smiling behind the scope, a line of Marines and National Guard officers watching in admiration. But the real exchange that mattered took place afterward, during coffee and cigarettes behind the range. The men from the civilian marksmanship program spoke of their hunting trips in Pennsylvania and Michigan, of climbing into wooden stands before dawn, of waiting motionless for hours until a white-tailed deer stepped into a clearing. One hunter demonstrated how he steadied his rifle against a branch, how he slowed his breathing so the sight would settle naturally. "We don't chase them," he said, drawing on his cigarette. "We just find the place where the deer has to come. Then we wait." Pavlichenko listened carefully, head tilted, the smoke curling between them like mist over a battlefield. It astonished her how closely these men's words mirrored the lectures she had given to young Red Army recruits in 1941. She had told them that patience killed more Germans than courage, that the sniper's strength was in knowing where the enemy must appear, not in chasing him across open ground. And yet these Americans had never seen Odessa, never crouched for days in a shattered trench. Their teachers had been forests, not wars. One of the older hunters, a man with hands like oak roots, handed her a small notebook filled with sketches of deer trails. Lines crossed through shaded groves and hollows, marked wind here, morning sun here. He laughed when she asked, through the interpreter, if this was military training. "No, ma'am," he said. "Just how my father taught me to hunt. If you move too much, the woods see you. So you stay still. Let the woods forget you're there." That phrase stayed with her. The woods must forget you. It was the same truth she had learned on the bluffs of Sevastopol, wrapped now in the language of hunters rather than soldiers. In her war, the woods were bomb-scarred gullies and burnt vineyards, but the principle was unchanged. Find the place of inevitability, become invisible, and let the enemy cross the line of your rifle's breath. Later that afternoon, she was invited to demonstrate her own technique. The range, officers expected her to speak about Soviet doctrine or the design of her rifle, but she surprised them. She asked for a spade. Within minutes, she had scraped a shallow depression into the earth beside a clump of grass, arranging her coat and rifle as if preparing for an ambush. "Sniper position," she explained through the interpreter. "Not high-low, always below horizon. The enemy will search the skyline, not the ground." She lay prone, sighting through the scope, motionless for what seemed an eternity. Only the slow rise and fall of her shoulders betrayed life. A crow cawed somewhere above. When she finally fired, the steel plate rang again, dead center. She rose, brushing dirt from her sleeves, and smiled faintly. The American hunters nodded, impressed. One of them muttered, "She hunts men the way we hunt deer." She turned toward the voice and said softly in Russian, "No, I hunt men the way they hunt us." That evening, at the reception hall in Washington, diplomats and journalists crowded around her. Flashbulbs popped. Questions came in quick succession. What was the secret of her success? How did a woman endure such horrors? Did she hate the Germans? She answered politely but sparingly, repeating the phrases her handlers had approved: courage, duty, comradeship. But when an elderly senator asked if she found American marksmanship impressive, she gave a different kind of answer. "You have many hunters," she said through her translator. "They know what patience is. They understand that to wait is harder than to shoot. In war, that is everything." The next morning's papers quoted her remark beneath headlines about Allied friendship, but few readers noticed the deeper meaning. For Pavlichenko, that day at the range had revealed something fundamental. Across oceans and ideologies, the language of the rifle was universal. Hunters and snipers shared the same discipline, the same conversation between breath, trigger, and heartbeat. As her train carried her north toward New York for the next stop of the Goodwill Tour, she jotted notes in a small leather book. Besides sketches of shooting positions, she wrote an English phrase she had copied phonetically from one of the Marines. "Let the deer come to you." Underneath, in Russian, she translated it, "Pust dobicha sama pridyot k тебе." It would become a mantra for her students when she returned home. She would teach them that the battlefield, like the forest, followed patterns, that men, like deer, walked the same paths again and again, that a sniper's art was not pursuit but preparation. Outside the window, the autumn countryside of Maryland slid past in gold and green. Somewhere in those woods, hunters were already building blinds for the coming season. Pavlichenko watched the trees blur together and thought of the ravines of Sevastopol, the smell of burned powder, the cold weight of the rifle in her hands. The worlds of hunter and soldier were separated by oceans, yet bound by the same breath. She closed her notebook and smiled faintly to herself. The Americans had shown her nothing she did not already know, only reminded her of the oldest truth in any war: patience is the deadliest weapon. And from that day on, whenever she taught new snipers the art of waiting, she would begin her lessons with a single borrowed phrase. "Remember," she would tell them, "you must not chase your enemy. Build the place. Let him come to you." Long before the name Lady Death appeared in any newspaper, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was simply another student at Kiev University, studying history by day and shooting targets by dusk at the local Osoaviakhim range. The Soviet Union had already turned rifle practice into a civic religion. Across the country, from Vladivostok to the Carpathians, millions of workers and students trained under the red banner of the Voroshilov sharpshooter movement. The badge-crossed rifles under a red star was as common as factory uniforms. Lyudmila wore hers proudly. It gleamed on her grey jacket as she lay prone in the damp Ukrainian grass, squeezing the trigger of her standard-issue Mosin Nagant. The air smelled of oil and earth, the way it always did in the training fields outside Kiev. Her instructor, a thin man with a scarred cheek and a Cossack's moustache, watched her through a spotting scope. "Don't rush," he said. "A bullet is a promise. You cannot take it back." She fired. The wooden target jerked, a neat hole appearing between the painted eyes. The instructor grunted approval. Again, 10 times. A good sniper must make her heart beat like a clock, not a drum. That was 1938. The world still seemed solid then. The Soviet papers spoke of peace, though everyone knew the war was coming. Pavlichenko's life revolved around two things: university lectures on medieval history and the rhythmic crack of rifle fire on weekend fields. The Osoaviakhim instructors drilled their students not merely as marksmen but as hunters. They taught them to read the wind by watching blades of grass, to estimate distance by the size of a matchbox held at arm's length. Instructors used animal metaphors constantly. "The German will think like a wolf," they said. "You must think like the hunter who traps the wolf. The doctrine was practical and ruthless. Soviet sniping had grown from the traditions of peasant hunting that stretched across Siberia and the Far East. Many instructors had once lived by the rifle, tracking elk or bear in the frozen forests. They believed that patience and camouflage, not bravery, were the highest virtues. When Lyudmila won her first regional competition, the newspaper Kievskaya Pravda printed a small note. Comrade Pavlichenko, a true daughter of socialism, demonstrates the precision of the Voroshilov school. She kept the clipping folded inside her diary. It meant nothing then, only that she was a good shot. Yet those habits, drilled in the quiet years, would soon decide whether she lived or died. By 1939, the war in Finland had begun, and the Soviet command saw the value of trained marksmen. The Red Army discovered that Finnish ski snipers could halt entire battalions. Reports filtered back. A single man hidden among the pines could delay a column for hours. The lesson was recorded in every military manual: individual marksmanship has strategic effect. At the Kiev training ground, the instructors began adding new lessons. They taught camouflage with burlap and grass, silent movement, and the art of the double position, firing from one nest, then vanishing to another before the enemy's counterfire arrived. They called it maskirovka, concealment, but among themselves the older men called it by another name, ochota, the hunt. In her notebook, Lyudmila drew sketches of positions: low hollows, broken walls, tree roots thick enough to hide a rifle barrel. She noted where shadows lay longest, where sound carried least. She was already thinking like the hunters her instructors admired. In the spring of 1941, she graduated from university and applied for officer training in the Red Army. The recruiting officer looked at her slender hands and frowned. "You'd be better off as a nurse," he said. She smiled politely, then placed her Voroshilov sharpshooter badge and her marksmanship records on his desk. Her scorecards spoke louder than her words. When the German invasion came that June, the transformation from student to sniper happened overnight. She was assigned to the 25th Rifle Division, defending Odessa. The city burned under summer skies, and the young woman who had once studied the reign of Ivan the Terrible found herself crawling through rubble with a scoped rifle. Her first kill came on the second day. A German scout had taken position behind a fallen column near the port. She watched him, through her scope, for an hour, studying the rhythm of his movement, the moment when his helmet rose above the stone, the pause before he shifted. She remembered her instructor's voice. "A bullet is a promise." When she squeezed the trigger, the man fell forward without sound. She did not feel triumph, only relief. The war had begun in earnest. Weeks later, Odessa was still under siege. Pavlichenko's unit was down to half strength. By then, she had made dozens of kills and earned a sniper's reputation. Her comrades joked that she could hit a moving coin. But at night, when the firing stopped, she cleaned her rifle by lantern light and thought of the quiet fields outside Kiev, of the scent of grass and the soft wind on her cheek. She realized those peaceful lessons had prepared her perfectly for this chaos. Every position she dug, every ambush she planned, came from the hunter's logic she had learned in Osoaviakim school. She mapped enemy routines the way a hunter mapped deer trails. She noted the times of patrols, the favorite routes of German officers, the spots where the morning sun blinded observers. By August, she had trained 3 new snipers, passing on the same rules. "Patience," she told them. "If you wait, they will walk into your sights." In the autumn of 1941, as Odessa fell and her unit retreated to Sevastopol, she began keeping a new notebook. On the first page, she wrote a single sentence: "The forest teaches better than the classroom." It was true in every way. The patient habits of Soviet sharpshooters, born from peasant hunters and perfected in pre-war rifle clubs, were saving lives now. They would soon save the Red Army itself. And when Lyudmila Pavlichenko later stood on that range in America and heard an old hunter say, "Let the deer come to you," she would recognize the same principle in a different tongue. What had begun as a Soviet creed had become universal, the quiet understanding that in the stillness between breaths lies victory. Long before the war brought its noise across the oceans, America was already a nation of riflemen. On summer mornings beside Lake Erie, the fields around Camp Perry shimmered with heat and the echo of bullets traveling downrange. The annual national matches drew everyone: army officers, factory workers, teenagers from the civilian marksmanship program, and old hunters who carried their rifles with the same reverence as priests carried chalices. There was no uniform ideology, no oath to a state, only a shared faith in precision. The American rifle culture had grown out of habit, not doctrine. Frontier survival had become weekend recreation. Boys in Michigan learned to shoot tin cans before they could drive a truck. Men in the Pennsylvania hills passed down Winchester lever actions the way others passed family Bibles. In those deer camps, marksmanship wasn't about trophies or medals. It was about patience, silence, and respect for the shot. In the autumn of 1939, an Iowa farmhand named Richard "Rick" Halvorsen left his family's cornfields to work as a mechanic in Toledo. On weekends, he joined a local rifle club affiliated with the National Rifle Association. He was an average shot, but he loved the ritual, the smell of gun oil, the snap of a paper target in the wind. Every November he went home for deer season, hiking into the hardwood ridges before dawn with his father's bolt-action Springfield. They had rules in that camp, passed down like gospel. Never waste ammunition, never take a shot you can't finish cleanly, and never chase a wounded animal. You find the funnel, his father would say. Every creature has to move through something narrow, a ravine, a ridge, a clearing. That's where you wait. The woods will bring him to you. It was the same logic Lyudmila Pavlichenko would later hear on the Washington Rifle Range, but Rick never imagined his quiet lessons would echo in another language half the world away. When war came in December of 1941, Halvorsen enlisted in the Army Air Forces. His mechanical skill put him in an ordnance unit at Eglin Field, Florida, where he learned to service the big Browning machine guns mounted on fighters. The instructors noticed his calm manner and steady hands. Before long, he was training pilots in marksmanship, how to harmonize 8 guns on a P-40 or P-38, how to understand bullet drop and wind drift. It's just like deer hunting, he'd say. You don't chase, you lead. That phrase, half joke, half wisdom, began spreading through the fighter training schools. The pilots came from cities and farms, but all understood what it meant. The ones who'd grown up hunting seemed to grasp gunnery faster. They already knew what it felt like to control breath under pressure, to make a decision between heartbeats. The army called it muscle discipline. The hunters called it the shot. Meanwhile, in the northern states, the civilian marksmanship program ramped up production of riflemen. Camp Perry's matches turned into unofficial training grounds for war. Teenagers who had once competed for silver badges now wore khaki and fired for their lives. Old range officers, some too aged to serve overseas, became instructors for Army and Marine recruits. They carried with them a hunter's philosophy disguised as marksmanship theory. Wait, read, and know the ground better than your enemy. In Pennsylvania, the deer camps changed tone. Younger men went to Europe or the Pacific, leaving the old-timers behind. Yet the camps still opened each November. Around the firelight, talk shifted from the biggest buck to the sons fighting overseas. They imagined their boys crouched in jungles or deserts, holding rifles that didn't look so different from the ones leaning against the cabin walls. In early 1942, an article in Outdoor Life magazine described Soviet sniper women fighting near Odessa. The piece mentioned one name, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and noted her hundreds of kills. "She hunts Nazis the way our boys hunt deer," the author wrote. The line stuck in Rick Halvorsen's mind. He clipped the article and pinned it to the bulletin board at the base armory, next to a photograph of his hometown's deer camp. He didn't know that the woman in that article would soon stand on American soil, rifle in hand, learning from men like him. Across the Atlantic, the same logic guided 2 worlds that had never met. The Soviet sniper schools trained peasants who had grown up trapping elk in Siberia. The United States trained hunters who had stalked deer in Appalachia. Both discovered that marksmanship was not a mechanical act but a moral rhythm, breath, pause, fire, truth. In April of 1942, Halvorsen was transferred to the newly formed Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Quantico as a civilian consultant. The Marines had begun studying enemy tactics in the Pacific, realizing that Japanese snipers were masters of concealment. They needed counter-snipers, and they sought advice from anyone who understood the woods. Rick found himself teaching camouflage to men barely 20 years old. "Blend with the terrain," he told them. "Don't look for the target. Wait where the target has to be." When Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived that September, he watched from the crowd as she fired her first American rifle. He didn't understand Russian, but when she struck the target dead center, he recognized the expression on her face, the same calm satisfaction every good hunter wears after a perfect shot. Afterward, he approached her with the help of an interpreter and offered a small brass cartridge from his pocket, engraved with a deer's silhouette. "From one hunter to another," he said. She nodded solemnly, not quite grasping his words but sensing their meaning. That evening, he wrote in his journal, "The Russian girl shoots like a ghost. The way she breathes, you'd think she grew up in Wisconsin woods. Funny thing we've been teaching her, but I think she already knew everything we know. Maybe she'll take a bit of it back, though the trick of waiting." By winter, Rick Halvorsen was on a transport to Guadalcanal, assigned to a Marine regiment as a weapons instructor. He carried with him that same patience from the deer camp, the understanding that stillness is deadlier than speed. And somewhere across the ocean, Lyudmila Pavlichenko carried the same lesson homeward in a small notebook written half in Cyrillic, half in English. Let the deer come to you. Neither of them knew it, but between the birch forests of Ukraine and the pine ridges of Pennsylvania, the craft of the hunter had already become the universal language of snipers. Long before the war brought its noise across the oceans, America was already a nation of riflemen. On summer mornings beside Lake Erie, the fields around Camp Perry shimmered with heat and the echo of bullets traveling downrange. The annual national matches drew everyone, army officers, factory workers, teenagers from the civilian marksmanship program, and old hunters who carried their rifles with the same reverence as priests carried chalices. There was no uniform ideology, no oath to a state, only a shared faith in precision. The American rifle culture had grown out of habit, not doctrine. Frontier survival had become weekend recreation. Boys in Michigan learned to shoot tin cans before they could drive a truck. Men in the Pennsylvania hills passed down Winchester lever actions the way others passed family Bibles. In those deer camps, marksmanship wasn't about trophies or medals. It was about patience, silence, and respect for the shot. In the autumn of 1939, an Iowa farmhand named Richard Rick Halvorsen left his family's cornfields to work as a mechanic in Toledo. On weekends, he joined a local rifle club affiliated with National Rifle Association. He was an average shot, but he loved the ritual. The smell of gun oil, the snap of a paper target in the wind. Every November he went home for deer season, hiking into the hardwood ridges before dawn with his father's bolt-action Springfield. They had rules in that camp, passed down like gospel. Never waste ammunition, never take a shot you can't finish cleanly, and never chase a wounded animal. You find the funnel, his father would say. Every creature has to move through something narrow, a ravine, a ridge, a clearing. That's where you wait. The woods will bring him to you. It was the same logic Lyudmila Pavlichenko would later hear on the Washington Rifle Range, but Rick never imagined his quiet lessons would echo in another language half a world away. When war came in December of 1941, Halvorsen enlisted in the Army Air Forces. His mechanical skill put him in an ordnance unit at Eglin Field, Florida, where he learned to service the big Browning machine guns mounted on fighters. The instructors noticed his calm manner and steady hands. Before long, he was training pilots in marksmanship, how to harmonize 8 guns on a P-40 or P-38, how to understand bullet drop and wind drift. It's just like deer hunting, he'd say. You don't chase, you lead. That phrase, half joke, half wisdom, began spreading through the fighter training schools. The pilots came from cities and farms, but all understood what it meant. The ones who'd grown up hunting seemed to grasp gunnery faster. They already knew what it felt like to control breath under pressure, to make a decision between heartbeats. The army called it muscle discipline. The hunters called it the shot. Meanwhile, in the northern states, the civilian marksmanship program ramped up production of riflemen. Camp Perry's matches turned into unofficial training grounds for war. Teenagers who had once competed for silver badges now wore khaki and fired for their lives. Old range officers, some too aged to serve overseas, became instructors for Army and Marine recruits. They carried with them a hunter's philosophy disguised as marksmanship theory: wait, read, and know the ground better than your enemy. In Pennsylvania, the deer camps changed tone. Younger men went to Europe or the Pacific, leaving the old-timers behind. Yet the camps still opened each November. Around the firelight, talk shifted from the biggest buck to the sons fighting overseas. They imagined their boys crouched in jungles or deserts, holding rifles that didn't look so different from the ones leaning against the cabin walls. In early 1942, an article in Outdoor Life magazine described Soviet sniper women fighting near Odessa. The piece mentioned one named Lyudmila Pavlichenko and noted her hundreds of kills. "She hunts Nazis the way our boys hunt deer," the author wrote, the line stuck in Rick Halvorson's mind. He clipped the article and pinned it to the bulletin board at the base armory, next to a photograph of his hometown's deer camp. He didn't know that the woman in that article would soon stand on American soil, rifle in hand, learning from men like him. Across the Atlantic, the same logic guided two worlds that had never met. The Soviet sniper schools trained peasants who had grown up trapping elk in Siberia. The United States trained hunters who had stalked deer in Appalachia. Both discovered that marksmanship was not a mechanical act, but a moral rhythm: breath, pause, fire, truth. In April of 1942, Halvorsen was transferred to the newly formed Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Quantico as a civilian consultant. The Marines had begun studying enemy tactics in the Pacific, realizing that Japanese snipers were masters of concealment. They needed counter-snipers, and they sought advice from anyone who understood the woods. Rick found himself teaching camouflage to men barely 20 years old. "Blend with the terrain," he told them. "Don't look for the target. Wait where the target has to be." When Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived that September, he watched from the crowd as she fired her first American rifle. He didn't understand Russian, but when she struck the target dead center, he recognized the expression on her face, the same calm satisfaction every good hunter wears after a perfect shot. Afterward, he approached her with the help of an interpreter and offered a small brass cartridge from his pocket, engraved with a deer's silhouette. She nodded solemnly, not quite grasping his words, but sensing their meaning. That evening, he wrote in his journal, "The Russian girl shoots like a ghost. The way she breathes, you'd think she grew up in Wisconsin woods. Funny thing we've been teaching her, but I think she already knew everything we know. Maybe she'll take a bit of it back, though the trick of waiting." By winter, Rick Halvorsen was on a transport to Guadalcanal, assigned to a Marine regiment as a weapons instructor. He carried with him that same patience from the deer camp, the understanding that stillness is deadlier than speed. And somewhere across the ocean, Lyudmila Pavlichenko carried the same lesson homeward in a small notebook written half in Cyrillic, half in English. "Let the deer come to you." Neither of them knew it, but between the birch forests of Ukraine and the pine ridges of Pennsylvania, the craft of the hunter had already become the universal language of snipers. The snow fell so thickly it muffled every sound but the wind. Outside the wooden barracks of the sniper training school near Vologda, the world was a white blur, the birch trees ghostly, the frozen Volga River a pale line vanishing into mist. Lyudmila Pavlichenko stood at the firing line with her students, their faces hidden behind frost-crusted scarves. They were young, most barely 20 years old, some still with the round faces of childhood, but their eyes were already hard. Every one of them had lost someone. This was the new generation of Soviet snipers, born not from pre-war marksmanship clubs, but from siege and starvation. The recruits came from Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kursk, from cities that had become synonyms for ruin. They had been soldiers, medics, factory workers, partisans. Now they were here to learn the discipline of patience. "Comrades," Pavlichenko said, her breath forming clouds that froze mid-air, "we do not hunt the enemy. We build the place where the enemy must appear." She spoke slowly, letting the translator repeat her words for those from distant republics. In her pocket she carried the small notebook she had filled during her American tour. On the first page, in neat Cyrillic, she had copied the English phrase she had learned in Washington, "Let the deer come to you." Below it she had written the Russian equivalent, and beneath that her own addition, "And when it comes, do not tremble." The men and women at the school listened in silence. They were used to hearing lectures filled with slogans about vengeance and patriotism. Pavlichenko's tone was different, calm, almost tender. She spoke of breathing, of how the heart must slow before the trigger moves. "You cannot hurry the rifle," she told them. "If you do, it will betray you." The instructors had built the school on the ruins of an old hunting lodge, confiscated from a noble family decades before. The irony was not lost on anyone. Where once Tsarist aristocrats had hunted elk and wolves, the Red Army now trained men and women to hunt Germans. The firing range extended into the forest, targets hidden among trees, trenches, and snowdrifts. Each exercise simulated not marksmanship contests but ambushes. Pavlichenko moved quietly among the trainees, correcting posture, adjusting rifles. She taught them to build snow screens, to hollow firing nests into drifts, so that even steam from breath would vanish into the air. When one young recruit asked how long a sniper should wait for a shot, she smiled faintly. "As long as it takes," she said. "Sometimes hours, sometimes a day. You will know the right moment because your fear will disappear." Her lessons were filled with parables from both sides of the world. She quoted her Soviet instructors, "A bullet is a promise you must keep," but also repeated the words of the American hunter she had met. "The woods must forget you are there." When a political officer questioned her about these foreign methods, she answered simply, "The deer does not care which flag the hunter carries." The school had begun producing results. The graduates went to the front around Rzhev and Smolensk, where the Red Army's winter offensives ground forward yard by yard. Reports returned, praising the new snipers for their discipline and uncanny patience. Enemy scouts fell in open ground. Officers were struck down between trenches. Machine gun crews abandoned positions they thought safe. German prisoners spoke of ghost bullets that came without warning. One evening, as the aurora flickered faintly above the frozen forest, Pavlichenko gathered her instructors inside the mess hall. They drank weak tea mixed with snowmelt and spoke of methods. Major Yakovlev, the school's director, praised her innovations. "You have turned them into hunters," he said. "They think like wolves." "No," she replied quietly. "They think like Americans." The officers laughed, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. In her mind, she could still see the wooded ranges of Pennsylvania, the flannel-clad men explaining how they waited above the trails. She realized that marksmanship had become a bridge between two worlds that distrusted each other in every other respect. Both believed in the same quiet truths: patience, precision, and respect for the moment. The next day she walked the training grounds alone, snow crunching under her boots. The students were practicing at 400 meters, their breath freezing into tiny clouds. Each shot cracked like a heartbeat in the still air. She stopped beside one girl, barely 19, from Leningrad, pale and hollow-eyed. The young sniper lay prone in the snow, her cheek against the cold wood of the rifle stock. "Who is your quarry?" Pavlichenko asked. "An officer," the girl whispered. "He crosses the trench line every morning." "Do not follow him," Pavlichenko said softly. "Build the place. Wait for him to come to you." That phrase had become the school's creed. It appeared on the chalkboard of every classroom and on the inside covers of training manuals. "Let the enemy come to you." The instructors shortened it to one Russian word: ожидание, waiting. It described not passivity but control, the mastery of the moment before the kill. In March, as the thaw began, Pavlichenko received a letter from the American embassy. It contained a small photograph taken months earlier on the Washington rifle range, her standing beside a line of Marines, smiling faintly. On the back someone had written, in neat cursive, "To Lady Death from the Deer Hunters of America." She kept the photograph pinned above her bunk. When the students asked about it, she would tell them, "These men taught me the trick of patience. They hunt differently, but they wait the same." By the end of 1943, the Vologda school had trained more than 800 snipers. Their collective kill count, according to Red Army archives, exceeded 10,000 enemy soldiers, but Pavlichenko considered the real success, not the numbers, but the discipline they carried with them. One snowy morning, before she left the school for good, she addressed her final graduating class. Her voice was low but carried through the cold air. "You will face fear and exhaustion. You will see death at arm's length. But remember what I have told you. The world will forget the noise of battle. It will remember only the stillness before the shot. That is where victory lives." As they saluted, the wind lifted her scarf and scattered snowflakes around her like ash. Somewhere far away, in another forest, half a world distant, an American hunter might have been climbing into his tree stand, waiting for dawn. Neither knew the other, yet both shared the same secret that patience, not power, decides who survives. In that silent communion between worlds, the hunter and the sniper became the same. The woods around Vitebsk were the color of gunmetal and ash. Birch trunks leaned like bones under the snow. Smoke from burning villages hung low, twisting through the branches and settling in men's lungs until they coughed black. Somewhere beyond those trees, the German line held a lattice of trenches, bunkers, and machine gun nests that had resisted every Soviet assault for months. At dawn, a patrol from the 39th Army crept forward through the half-light. Among them moved 3 snipers from the Vologda school, led by a young woman named Anya Sokolova. Her breath plumed softly through the veil of her camouflage hood. The rifle across her chest, a worn Mosin Nagant with a PU scope, was wrapped in strips of white cloth. She carried herself with the same stillness her teacher, Pavlichenko, had drilled into every student. Slow movement, low profile, never break the line of the horizon. They found a rise overlooking a frozen stream. To the east lay the German outpost, a cluster of dugouts beneath pine boughs. Steam from cooking fires rose like ghostly pillars. Anya studied the ground through her scope, tracing the patterns of footprints, the rhythm of guards changing positions. The others whispered suggestions about angles and targets, but she said nothing. "Let them come to you," she murmured at last, almost to herself. They built their nest the way she had been taught, shallow trench, snow mounded high behind them, fir branches for cover. Then they waited. Hours passed. The cold crawled into their bones until their fingers felt carved from wood. A German sentry appeared at last, walking the same path Anya had marked earlier. He stopped, turned his back to light a cigarette, and for a heartbeat the wind stilled. The shot cracked softly, swallowed by the snow. The sentry folded wordlessly. The others did not move. There was no need. The place had worked exactly as intended. The next day, the regiment commander called for Anya and her partner. Their report listed 5 confirmed kills. But what impressed him was not the number, it was the patience. "You could have shot all morning," he said. "Why only 5? Anya replied, "Because only 5 mattered." That phrase spread among the units along the front. Commanders began repeating it to new snipers. Only the ones that matter. It was the hunter's logic, stripped of glory and turned into doctrine. By February, the Soviet winter offensives were rolling west, and sniper detachments moved with the advancing rifle divisions. They became the eyes and claws of the infantry small teams operating ahead of the main body, mapping strong points, eliminating officers, watching how the Germans reacted. The reports that reached Moscow described them as autonomous elements of battlefield intelligence, but the soldiers themselves used a different word, ochotniki hunters. At night, around the tiny stoves of peasant huts, they shared tricks of the craft: how to read snow for footprints, how to tell by a crow's call that someone had moved nearby, how to use steam from a kettle to reveal wind direction. And in every conversation, somewhere, someone would repeat the same lesson Pavlichenko had brought back from America. Build the place, the quarry will come. Sometimes it was spoken like superstition, other times like prayer. When the thaw came that spring, the snowfields turned to lakes of mud. The front pushed deeper into Belarus, through forests thick with smoke and sap. In April, Anya's team found themselves trapped after a failed assault near the Berezina River. The Germans held the opposite bank, and the Soviets had no bridges left. For 2 days, the snipers hid in the reeds, half submerged, surviving on melted snow. On the third morning, Anya watched a German officer step to the river's edge, binoculars glinting in the pale sun. She steadied her rifle across a branch, felt the pulse slow in her neck, and remembered the American hunter's words she had once read in Pavlichenko's notebook. Patience makes the target forget you exist. She waited until the officer raised his hand to signal the artillery battery behind him. Then she exhaled and fired. The man fell, his signal never given. The Soviet infantry crossed the river that evening under cover of fog. When Anya reported back, her commander shook his head. "How did you know when to fire?" "I didn't," she said. "I just stopped waiting." That spring, her story reached Moscow through army newspapers. Pavlichenko, now working as an instructor at the Central Women's Sniper School, read it aloud to her students. She did not mention that the line "Let the quarry come to you" had once been spoken by a bearded man in a flannel jacket under the green canopies of Pennsylvania. The war had burned away borders, and only the method remained. Across continents, hunters and soldiers now shared the same creed. In stillness lay victory. In silence, survival. And in every careful trigger pull, a faint echo of both Odessa and Ohio. The war's last months smelled of thawing mud and oil smoke. In the Far East, Soviet forces were gathering along the Amur River, preparing for the inevitable clash with Japan. Among the units assigned to the theater was a composite sniper detachment, veterans from every front, or men and women who had served from Stalingrad to Smolensk. Their unofficial commander was Captain Anya Sokolova, by then a legend in the Sniper Corps, though she still carried the same worn rifle wrapped in white cloth. Sokolova's detachment trained on the frozen plains of Sakhalin, where the birch forests ran down to the sea. The war here was not yet declared, but everyone knew it was coming. Across the narrow straits lay Japanese garrisons in Manchuria and the Kuriles. The Soviets drilled daily, building hidden positions among the dunes, mapping every approach to the beaches. One evening in early March, as the sun bled out over the ice, Sokolova gathered her team around a driftwood fire. The men were exhausted hunters turned soldiers, who now waited for a war that seemed frozen in time. She spoke softly, the way Pavlichenko once had. "Do you know where this fire comes from?" she asked. "From America. The fuel drums came with the Lend-Lease ships. Their hunters taught our teacher, and she taught us." No one replied. They only listened, the wind keening through the trees. Sokolova's words carried across the ice like a secret binding 2 continents. Far away, in Washington, that same March, an aging ordnance instructor named Rick Halvorsen limped up the steps of the Naval War College. He had survived Guadalcanal and Bougainville, where his lesson of patience had saved dozens of Marines. Now he was helping train post-war rifle instructors, men who would soon return home to farms and factories. When he spoke to the class, he didn't talk about ballistics or sights. He told them about stillness. "There's a trick," he said. "I heard it from a Russian once. Wait until the target forgets you exist. Works for deer, works for men?" A colonel in the audience frowned. "That Russian, was she the one they called Lady Death?" Halvorsen nodded slowly. "She taught the world the same thing we learned in the woods. War just made us understand how true it was." The students scribbled notes, though few grasped what he meant. For Halvorsen, every shot was a lesson written in the oldest language of survival. In August, when the Soviet Union finally struck Japan, Sokolova's detachment crossed the Amur in silence. The sky burned with artillery fire. They advanced through mist and shattered pine forests toward Japanese outposts on the border. The Japanese were veterans too, men hardened by years in Manchuria. They knew the ground and fought to the last cartridge. But the Soviet snipers had learned something else. They no longer searched for targets. They waited for movement, for sound, for breath. Each shot they fired came from a place of calm, so complete it felt like prayer. After the campaign ended, the official reports listed their performance in numbers: 340 confirmed kills, 0 captured. But the statistics meant nothing beside what the survivors carried home: the knowledge that the art of the hunt had crossed oceans and ideologies. When the war finally ended, Sokolova was summoned to Moscow for debriefing. She arrived in the capital just as the autumn rains began. The city was grey and weary, its banners limp from victory parades. In a small conference room at the Academy of the Red Army, she gave her final statement. "Our best lessons," she said, "did not come from manuals. They came from the forest, from the way animals move, from patience, and once, from hunters who spoke another language but lived by the same rules." The officer taking notes looked puzzled. "You mean Americans?" Sokolova smiled faintly. "No, hunters. The forest has no nationality." Outside, thunder rolled over the Kremlin domes. Somewhere across the sea, in the Pennsylvania hills, autumn leaves were falling, and deer hunters were climbing to their stands, waiting in the same silence she had once taught her soldiers. The war had ended, but its echoes remained in the click of a safety catch, the die, whisper of breath against a rifle stock, and the shared wisdom of those who had learned to wait for the moment when the world went still. And so the trick survived, born in the forests of two nations, carried through blood and ice, passed from hunter to sniper and back again. A simple truth: unbound by flags, the one who waits wins. When the smoke cleared and the banners came down, the world divided into silence. Soldiers went home, rifles were melted for scrap, and the word sniper, once shouted in fear or pride, became something people avoided saying at all. But in small classrooms and cold shooting ranges, the art of patience refused to die. In Moscow, Captain Anya Sokolova stood once again at the Vologda range, now renamed the Central Marksmanship Laboratory of the People's Commissariat of Defense. The political officers wanted new manuals, filled with formulas and slogans for the post-war army. She gave them something else: a doctrine of stillness. Her training, guide 32 pages mimeographed on coarse grey paper, was titled "On the Preparation of the Sniper in the Conditions of Peace." It began with a line that startled her superiors: "The shot is not war. The shot is silence made visible." Each page detailed methods drawn from a dozen traditions: Finnish patience, Siberian stealth, and, discreetly coded, the American trick. "Build the terrain to your advantage," she wrote. "Create inevitability, not pursuit. The enemy is only visible when he believes he is unseen." Her students, young conscripts too late for the great patriotic war, learned from her as if she were teaching a religion. She drilled them not only to shoot but to listen to snow melting on branches, to the rhythm of their own heartbeats. When a commissar asked why she wasted time with such philosophy, she answered, "Because bullets are physics, but victory is psychology." Thousands of kilometers away, in northern Minnesota, autumn returned to the woods. Rick Halvorsen, his knee ruined from Guadalcanal, limped through the maples with his teenage son, teaching him how to sight a deer trail. He no longer wore a uniform, but his rifle carried the same weight of discipline. "Most hunters don't miss because they can't aim," he told the boy, crouching by a frozen creek. "They miss because they don't wait long enough." His son squinted through the rifle's scope at a clearing of amber grass. "How long do you wait?" Rick smiled faintly. "Until it feels like the world forgot you're here." When the shot came, a single crack that echoed down the ravine, it was clean, precise, inevitable. The boy looked to his father for praise, but Rick only nodded, remembering jungles, remembering a woman with dark eyes who had stood beside him on an American range 3 years before. Across the ocean, in the ruins of Munich, former Wehrmacht officers gathered under the supervision of Allied intelligence. Among them was a gaunt man named Oberleutnant Hans Meyer, once a sniper instructor on the Eastern Front. Interrogation records from that year capture his words. The Russians changed. They learned to wait. After 43, our men would freeze for hours, afraid to move. We used to think of them as impulsive, reckless. Then they became hunters. I think they learned from the Americans somehow different uniforms, same patience. The Allied officer conducting the debrief nodded without comment. He had heard the same observation from other prisoners. The skill had migrated invisibly, like wind. By 1947, both nations' now wary allies turned adversaries were quietly studying one another again. In Langley, Virginia, a classified Army report titled Comparative Sniper Doctrine, U.S., and Soviet Forces analyzed captured Red Army manuals. One paragraph noted, Soviet snipers exhibit discipline in concealment comparable to frontier-trained American marksmen. Emphasis on natural terrain use appears to reflect hunting origins rather than purely military training. The irony went unspoken. Each side thought it was studying the other, but both were staring into the same mirror. That winter, Sokolova received a letter through a veterans' exchange, routed clumsily through Finland. It was unsigned, written in English on thin paper. We still hunt the same way, only now for peace. If you ever walk the woods again, listen for the quiet before the shot. That's where we both live. She kept the letter folded inside her manual until the end of her life. And so, in that uneasy peace after the war, the lineage of patience endured not in parades or medals, but in gestures repeated in every generation, the slow exhale, the steady aim, the waiting stillness before decision. It belonged to no ideology, no army, no border. It belonged to those who understood that silence, not noise, is the truest expression of mastery. From the birch forests of Vologda to the maple ridges of Minnesota, from ruined Munich to New Moscow, the world went quiet, and in that quiet, hunters and soldiers shared one final lesson. Victory is not the shot itself, but the calm that makes it possible. The next great war arrived not as a declaration, but as a cold wind over divided ground. In the hills of Korea, frost glittered on the barrels of American M1D rifles. In the east, beyond Vladivostok, the Soviet Union trained new marksmen for contingencies they denied existed. Across two hemispheres, students once separated by ideology were unknowingly studying the same gospel: patience, concealment, inevitability. Sergeant Daniel Buck, Rawlins of the U.S. Marine Corps crouched behind a frost-blackened boulder overlooking the Naktong Valley. He had learned to shoot deer in the forests of Maine before the Depression took his family farm. The Marines had since turned that skill into doctrine. His instructors at Camp Pendleton called it stalking fire control. But the Corps, that idea came from an older story. Let the quarry come to you. That morning, February of 1951, a North Korean officer had been spotted directing troops across a frozen river. Rawlins settled his rifle against a pile of sandbags. He did not hunt men with hatred, he hunted them with stillness. The world seemed to pause. A faint wind rippled the ice. The officer raised his binoculars. Rawlins exhaled and touched the trigger. The bullet travelled less than a second, but it carried a century of knowledge from Pennsylvanian hunters to Pavlichenko's schools to the manuals of the new Marine Corps Scout Sniper program. When the shot landed, the Marines around him whispered approval, but Rawlins only nodded. "You don't chase the target," he said quietly. "You build the place where he'll appear." Back at base, a correspondent from Stars and Stripes asked where he'd learned such patience. "From a man who learned it from a woman," Rawlins answered, smiling, slightly. "She fought in Europe, long before any of us came here. Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko." The journalist thought it a joke, but it wasn't. After the war, Pavlichenko's translated memoirs had circulated through the Marine Corps archives. Her phrase, "patience is marksmanship," multiplied by time, had become unofficial scripture. That same winter, 5,000 miles away, the Soviet army operated a remote sniper school outside Sverdlovsk. Snow fell in sheets so thick it buried sound itself. Captain Anya Sokolova, grey now at the temples, taught from a wooden platform over a frozen range. Her students were young men destined for border units or international service, though no one said the word Korea aloud. The Soviet program had changed names, but not essence. Each trainee carried a Mosin Nagant modified with a side-mount scope and a small leather book called The Manual of the Forest Shooter. Every morning began with an exercise Sokolova called the Hour of Nothing, 60 minutes of absolute stillness in snowdrifts up to their shoulders. "Do not aim until the forest forgets you are there," she would whisper through the wind. "It is the same rule for hunting elk or for war. The difference is only what you feel afterward." One day, a political officer visited the range to ensure ideological compliance. He asked why her students wasted so much ammunition on slow fire rather than rapid volleys. Sokolova replied, 100 loud misses make less history than one quiet hit." The officer frowned but said nothing. Moscow measured results, not philosophy, and her graduates rarely missed. Among the trainees was Sergeant Ivan Zhukov, who would later serve as an advisor in China. In his diary, recovered decades later, he wrote, "Our instructor spoke often of an American hunter. She said the forest teaches all men the same truth, that victory is not to strike, but to wait. I believe her. I watched a wolf circle a deer for 3 hours before it moved. When it struck, it did so only once." In the same year, on the other side of the Arctic Circle, a new branch of the U.S. Army Arctic Test Division was forming near Fairbanks, Alaska. Their mission was to train soldiers in survival and reconnaissance across snowbound terrain. The manual compiled that year included a section lifted almost word for word from Sokolova's Soviet teachings, though the Americans did not know it. It read, "Movement must be reduced until unseen. When the world no longer remembers your existence, the moment to act has arrived." The source citation simply said, "Field Notes, Maine Hunters, 1943. The circle of knowledge was complete, an invisible loop connecting Maine to Moscow to Alaska. During an exercise near the Yukon River, an Alaskan instructor named Lieutenant Paul Harris demonstrated patience shooting. He placed recruits along a ridge and told them to hold position through a blizzard until they could no longer feel their fingers. When one recruit complained, Harris recounted a story of a Soviet woman who had done the same in Sevastopol. He did not know her name. He had only heard the legend from an old Marine sergeant during the war. But the story worked. The recruits waited. When the storm cleared, they fired together, each hitting the center of a wooden target that had stood untouched for hours. By the end of 1951, the sniper trick had evolved into institutional doctrine on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The U.S. Army Field Manual FM 23-10 and the Soviet Rukovodstvo po Strelkovomu Delu each carried sections that mirrored one another: camouflage principles, shooting positions, breathing control, and, always, patience. Neither side cited the other, yet both owed the same intellectual debt to the forests where deer hunters once waited for movement in the dawn light. Historians would later call it parallel development, but those who practiced it knew better. Some truths were too old for ownership. That December, in a small flat in Moscow, Sokolova received an American hunting magazine through the diplomatic pouch of a journalist acquaintance. On the back cover was a photograph of 2 men in flannel jackets perched in a snowy tree stand, rifles across their knees. The caption read, "The secret is waiting." She smiled, tracing the printed faces with her thumb. In another world, they could have been her students. Meanwhile, in a marine tent on the Korean peninsula, Sergeant Rawlins sat cleaning his rifle under the glow of a kerosene lamp. Pinned above his cot was a page torn from a Soviet propaganda leaflet showing a woman sniper aiming through a scope. He had found it on a captured prisoner, kept it for luck. Sometimes, when the wind was quiet, he imagined that somewhere far away That woman had once said the same words he now repeated to his own men. Do not chase the target, build the place where he must appear. Outside, snow fell on two armies, two ideologies, and one shared silence. The rifles of both hunters and soldiers rested against the frozen earth. Their barrels pointed toward different horizons, but their purpose identical. The world had changed its flags, its languages, its enemies, but the oldest war, the one between patience and haste, went on, and in that long winter of 1951, across the vastness of two continents, the calm of a single moment bound them all: the Soviet captain, the American sergeant, the Alaskan instructor, and every hunter who had ever waited in the cold for the world to breathe before the shot.